Chapter 1. Facing the Pain. Have you ever felt like you are drifting through life? Watching the days blur into months, and the months into years, without ever truly moving forward. Have you ever looked in the mirror and realized that the person staring back at you is far from the hero you once dreamed of becoming? Today, at Level Up Graded Readers, we begin a journey about a man named Elias, a man who had everything, then lost it all, and finally found the secret to rebuilding a life of power before the rest of the world even opens its eyes. The room was heavy with the scent of stale air and missed opportunities. Elias lay in bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, paralyzed by a familiar, crushing weight. It was 8:45 a.m. The sun was already high, piercing through the gaps in the curtains like a judgmental finger, pointing at his failure. On the nightstand, his phone was a graveyard of notifications, missed calls from his boss, urgent emails, and reminders of bills he couldn't pay. Each vibration of the phone felt like a hammer blow to his spirit. He had hit the snooze button 5 times. Every time he pressed that button, he wasn't just asking for 10 more minutes of sleep. He was subconsciously telling the world that he wasn't ready to face his own life. Elias sat up, his head throbbing with the dull ache of a man who had stayed up too late doing nothing. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. Just 2 years ago, these hands had signed major contracts. Now, they could barely hold a cup of coffee without trembling. He walked to the kitchen, stepping over piles of laundry and unopened mail. The silence in his apartment was loud. It was the sound of a life that had stalled. He realized with a sudden, cold terror that he was no longer the main character of his own story. He was just a spectator, a ghost haunting his own hallways. "I'll start tomorrow," he whispered to the empty room. But even as the words left his lips, he knew it was a lie. He had been saying tomorrow for 1,000 days. The truth was raw and ugly. His lack of discipline was killing him. His habit of avoiding the hard things had turned his potential into a prison. He was comfortable in his misery, and that was the most dangerous place to be. He realized that if he did not change something fundamental, something at the very core of his daily existence, he would continue to drown in this sea of mediocrity until there was nothing left of the man he used to be. He looked out the window at the bustling city below. People were rushing, chasing dreams, or perhaps just running away from their own shadows. Elias felt like he was standing on the edge of a great cliff. He could jump into the abyss of total failure, or he could find a way to climb back up. But the climb looked impossible from where he stood. He was out of shape, out of money, and out of time, or so he thought. In that moment of absolute deadlock, a single, sharp thought pierced through his brain. Your life is a reflection of your morning routine. He had spent his mornings hiding from the world. And in return, the world was hiding its rewards from him. He looked at the clock again. It was 9:15 a.m. The day was already half gone, and he hadn't even started. He felt a surge of silent anger, not at the world, not at his boss, but at himself. He gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until his knuckles turned white. He didn't need a miracle. He didn't need a lottery win. He needed a blueprint. He needed a way to take back his power before the noise of the world could drown out his intentions. If you want to find that power with Elias, make sure you subscribe to Level Upgraded Readers and commit to this journey with us. But as he looked at the messy apartment and his own tired reflection in the toaster, a doubt crept in. Could a man who couldn't even beat his alarm clock ever hope to beat the world? Chapter 2. The Ghost of Yesterday. The silence of the apartment was not just an absence of sound. It was a heavy blanket woven from years of almosts and not quites. Elias stood in his dimly lit hallway, his eyes falling on a stack of dusty journals on a shelf. He pulled one out. The pages were filled with grand plans from 3 years ago, ambitious goals, business ideas, and fitness schedules. All of them started with a burst of energy, and all of them died within a week. He remembered the voice of his father, a man of steel and early mornings, who used to say, "Elias, a man without a morning is a man without a soul." At the time, Elias had laughed. He thought he was smarter than the old ways. He thought he could work late, sleep in, and still conquer the world. But as he looked at those unfinished journals, he realized he had spent his youth building a monument to his own procrastination. The root of his struggle wasn't a lack of talent. Elias was brilliant when he was on. The problem was that he was rarely on. He was a slave to his moods. If he felt tired, he slept. If he felt bored, he scrolled through his phone for hours. He had allowed his feelings to become the captain of his ship. And his feelings were lazy. They preferred the comfort of the dark room over the challenge of the bright sun. He recalled a specific moment from his last job, the moment the rot truly started. He was leading a project that required consistent, daily attention. But he had skipped one morning, then another, convincing himself he would catch up later. The later never came. He watched as a younger, less talented colleague took the lead because that colleague was there at his desk, focused and ready, while Elias was still struggling to get out of bed. The sting of that memory felt like an open wound. It wasn't just a missed promotion. It was the realization that he was becoming a man that people could not rely on. He walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. He looked at the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. This wasn't just physical tiredness. It was the fatigue of a soul that had stopped fighting. He had spent so long avoiding the ghosts of his past that they had finally caught up to him. Every time he had chosen the easy path, he had chipped away at his own self-respect. Now, there was almost nothing left. He knew that the world didn't care about his excuses. The world only cared about results. And his results were a direct reflection of his internal chaos. He felt a deep sense of regret, a heavy, cold stone in his chest. He had been a lion who chose to live like a sheep, and now he was forgotten by the pride. The root of his failure was simple. He had never learned to say no to his comfort. He had never learned that the greatest war is not against the world, but against the version of himself that wanted to stay under the covers. As the clock ticked toward 1:000 a.m., the weight of his past seemed to pull at his shoulders, trying to drag him back to the sofa. He felt the familiar urge to give up, to hide, to let the day slide into nothingness once again. The shadows of his yesterday were whispering that it was too late to change. But if he stayed in this shadow, would there ever be another sunrise for his dreams? Chapter 3. The Cold Truth. The afternoon sun was harsh, but it felt cold to Elias as he stood in front of his apartment building, holding a single cardboard box. It was over. The company hadn't just let him go. They had replaced him before he even cleared his desk. The words of his manager echoed in his mind like a recurring nightmare. Elias, we need people who are present. We need people who lead. You are just here. Being told you are invisible is a pain that cuts deeper than any insult. He walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench, the box resting heavily on his knees. Inside were the remnants of a career he had once been proud of: a nameplate, a few pens, and a framed photo of himself at a graduation ceremony. In the photo, he looked young, vibrant, and full of fire. Now, he felt like a hollow shell. He looked at his reflection in the glass of the frame. The man looking back was defeated. He had lost his job. His bank account was nearly empty, and his self-esteem was non-existent. This was his breaking point. As he sat there, a group of successful-looking professionals walked by, laughing and discussing their plans for the next big project. They radiated an energy that Elias had forgotten: the energy of purpose. One of them glanced at Elias and his box, a brief look of pity crossing their face before they looked away. That look was the final spark. It wasn't anger at the stranger. It was a violent, silent outrage at his own weakness. He realized that the world had moved on without him because he had stopped moving. He thought about his rent, which was due in 3 days. He thought about the debt collectors who had started calling his phone every hour. The fissure in his life had become a canyon, and he was falling into it. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to throw the box, to scream, to do anything to break the suffocating silence of his failure. But he didn't. Instead, he felt a strange, cold clarity. When you have nothing left to lose, you finally become dangerous to your own excuses. He realized that his tomorrow had finally run out. There were no more excuses left to make. No more "I'm tired" or "I'll start next week." The truth was as cold and hard as the pavement beneath his feet if he didn't change his mindset and his action right now. He wouldn't just be unemployed, he would be extinct. He was tired of being the man who almost made it. He was tired of being the man people pitied. He stood up, his grip tightening on the cardboard box until the edges crumpled. He didn't head back to his apartment to sleep or to hide. He walked with a new, heavy purpose. The pain of staying the same had finally become greater than the pain of changing. He looked at the setting sun and made a silent, grim vow. He would not let the world win. He would find a way to rebuild, even if he had to do it stone by stone. Starting in the darkest hours of the night. As he reached his door, he didn't look at his bed with longing. He looked at his alarm clock with a sense of impending war. He knew that the next few hours would decide the rest of his life. The breaking point had reached its limit, and something inside Elias was about to snap or ignite. Could a man who had been shattered by the world find the strength to put the pieces back together when everything was working against him? The answer was waiting in the silence of the coming night. Chapter 4. The night was not silent. It was filled with the screaming voices of Elias's own doubts. He sat at his small kitchen table, the only light coming from a single, flickering bulb above his head. The cardboard box from the park sat on the floor, a constant reminder of his fallen status. He looked at his reflection in the window, but he didn't see a man. He saw a ghost of potential. "Is this it?" he asked the darkness. "Is this how my story ends?" One voice in his head, the voice of his old habits, told him to go to sleep. It whispered that he was tired, that the world was unfair, and that a few more hours of rest would make him feel better. This was the voice of the comfort zone, the same voice that had kept him in bed until 9:00 a.m. for years. But another voice, small and sharp like a needle, began to speak. It was the voice of his discipline, long buried under layers of laziness. It told him the truth. The world didn't owe him anything. If he wanted a different life, he had to become a different man. He realized that his life was like a building that had burned down, and he was still trying to live in the ashes. He needed a new foundation. He needed a blueprint. He thought back to the successful people he had seen in the park. What did they have that he didn't? It wasn't just money. It was a relationship with time. They owned their day, while the day owned Elias. He picked up a pen and a scrap of paper. His hand was steady now. He wrote one sentence: "I will not let the sun beat me to the start of the day." It was a simple thought, but it felt like a declaration of war. He realized that the battle for his life wouldn't be won in a boardroom or a bank. It would be won at 5:00 a.m. in the silence of his own home. This was the moment of awakening. He understood that his greatest enemy wasn't his boss or his bad luck. It was the version of himself that loved the snooze button more than his dreams. He stood up and walked to the trash can, one by one. He threw away the things that kept him distracted, the half-empty bags of junk food, the remote control, and the old excuses. The air in the apartment felt different. The fissure was still there, but he was no longer afraid of falling into it. He was ready to jump over it. He set his alarm for fem null a.m. His heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't the fast beat of fear, but the heavy, rhythmic beat of a soldier preparing for a mission. He knew that the man who went to sleep tonight would not be the same man who woke up tomorrow. He looked at the clock. It was midnight. He had 5 hours. 5 hours to decide if he was a victim or a victor. He closed his eyes and whispered a final, chilling question to himself. If not now, then when? If not me, then who? He lay down, but he didn't sleep like a defeated man. He waited like a predator. He knew that at 5:00 a.m., the first bell would ring, and the real fight would begin. But would his body obey his mind when the cold morning air hit his skin? Deadly embrace of his old life. Chapter 5. Leaving Comfort. 4:59 a.m. The world was a tomb of silence, dark and indifferent. Elias lay under the heavy warmth of his blanket, the only sound being the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, the alarm shattered the stillness. It wasn't a soft melody. It was a violent, piercing cry for change. His heart skipped a beat. His first instinct, the habit of 1,000 failures, was to reach out and silence the noise. to crawl back into the dark. Cozy embrace of his pillows. His mind whispered, "Just one more hour. You're tired. You can start tomorrow." This was the hard departure. This was the moment where dreams either live or die. Elias felt the physical weight of his old life pulling him down. His room was freezing, and the floor looked like a cold, gray ocean he didn't want to swim in. But then, he remembered the cardboard box in the park. He remembered the pity in the stranger's eyes. He realized that the warmth of his bed was actually a cage. With a sudden, guttural growl, he threw the covers back. The cold air hit his skin like 1,000 needles. A shocking reminder that he was alive. His feet touched the floor. The wood was ice cold, sending a shiver up his spine that made his teeth chatter. He stood up, his body trembling, his mind screaming for him to lie back down. Every muscle ached with the weight of years of neglect. But he didn't stop. He didn't think. He simply moved. He walked to the bathroom and turned the faucet. He didn't wait for the water to get warm. He splashed the freezing liquid directly onto his face. The shock was total. It was a baptism of discipline. He looked at himself in the mirror. In the dim light, he saw a man who was terrified. His eyes were wide, and his breath came in short, jagged gasps. He was leaving the only world he knew, the world of comfort, excuse, and slow decay. He was stepping into a world of uncertainty, pain, and effort. This was the most difficult walk of his life, the 10 steps from his bed to his desk. He put on his workout clothes, his fingers fumbling with the laces of his shoes. The apartment felt different at this hour. It felt like a sanctuary, a private training ground where the new Elias was being born. He felt a strange sense of hope, a nervous energy that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just waking up. He was escaping. He was a prisoner of his own making. And he had just found the key to the cell. He opened his front door and stepped into the hallway. The building was silent, but he felt like he was marching to the beat of a drum. He walked down the stairs, each step a declaration of independence from his former self. As he reached the street, the city was a ghost town. The air was crisp and smelled of rain and possibilities. He was alone. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel lonely. He felt powerful. He began to walk, then to jog. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead. Every step was a battle against the old Elias who wanted him to turn back. But he kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the first sign of light. He had left the harbor of safety, and he was heading into the storm of his own transformation. He was far from his old life now, but the path ahead was steep and filled with shadows. The first hour was won, but the day was long. As he ran through the empty streets, a cold wind began to blow, and a new fear crept into his heart. Could he sustain this fire when the world woke up and tried to blow it out? The real test was only beginning. Chapter 6. The grind begins. The initial rush of excitement had vanished, replaced by the heavy, gray reality of the grind. It was now the 3rd week of Elias's new life, The 5:00 a.m. alarm no longer felt like a call to adventure. It felt like a cold command from a strict master. His body was a map of aches and pains. His legs were heavy from the daily runs. And his mind was weary from the intense hours of study and planning. This was the phase of discipline, the boring, repetitive, and exhausting work that happens in the dark. Every morning, the scene was the same. The cold floor, the splashing of water, the bitter taste of black coffee, and the silence of his apartment. Elias sat at his desk, his eyes burning as he studied market trends and built his new business strategy. There were no crowds to cheer for him. There were no likes or comments on his progress. It was just him and the ticking clock. He realized that success isn't a sudden explosion of glory. Disciplined choices made when you are tired and alone. He began to track his time with military precision. Every hour had a purpose. He stopped scrolling and started searching. He stopped wishing and started working. But the old Elias was still there, whispering in his ear during the difficult moments. When his code wouldn't work or his emails went unanswered, the voice would say, "See, nothing has changed. You're still a failure. Go back to sleep." But Elias had learned a new skill, the art of the rebound. When he failed a small task, he didn't let it ruin his day. He simply took a deep breath, whispered, "Next," and started again. He was no longer working for a boss or for a paycheck. He was working to prove to himself that he could be a man of his word. He was building a mindset of steel, one boring morning at a time. His apartment, once a place of decay, was now a laboratory of self-improvement. He had a blueprint taped to his wall, a list of daily habits that were non-negotiable. 5:00 a.m. Wake up. 5:15 a.m. movement. 6:00 a.m. deep work. 8:00 a.m. learning. He was no longer a victim of his schedule. He was the architect of it. He felt a grim satisfaction in the fatigue. Each drop of sweat on his notebook was a payment toward his future freedom. The world still saw him as the man who lost his job. But internally, Elias was becoming a giant. He was learning that discipline is the highest form of self-love. By forcing himself to do the hard things, he was finally giving himself a chance to win. The repetition was exhausting, and the progress was slow. But he was moving. He was no longer drifting. He was rowing against the current with everything he had. But as the days turned into a month, the isolation began to take its toll. The wall of exhaustion was rising higher every day. And a new, more dangerous temptation was waiting around the corner. He had proven he could start. But could he endure when the world tried to push him back into the shadows? Chapter 7. The Temptation of Old Ways. The honeymoon phase of transformation was over, and Elias had finally hit the wall. It was a Tuesday morning, a 4:58 a.m. For the first time since he began this journey, Elias didn't just feel tired, he felt broken. His joints ached with a dull, persistent throb, and his brain felt like it was wrapped in a thick, gray fog. The alarm clock on his phone began to vibrate, and the sound felt like a physical attack on his soul. This was the moment of peak tension. His mind, usually his ally now, turned into a cunning enemy. It began to bargain. "You've worked hard for a month," it whispered. "One day of sleep won't hurt. You deserve a break. Look at you, you're exhausted." The external world wasn't helping either. The night before, he had run into an old friend who laughed when Elias mentioned his new routine. A 5 a.m. blueprint. "Elias, stop dreaming," his friend had said, a smirk of pity on his face. "You're an owl, not a lark. You're just going to burn out and end up right back where you started. Come out for drinks tonight and forget this nonsense." Those words now echoed in the dark room, louder than his own heartbeat. The pressure from people who wanted him to stay average was a heavy, invisible weight. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. The temptation to quit was a physical pull, a magnetic force dragging him back toward the pillows. He felt the sting of hot tears in his eyes, tears of frustration and pure, raw fatigue. He was fighting a war on two fronts, against his own body and against the expectations of everyone who knew the old Elias. He looked at his desk, where his blueprint was taped. It looked like a joke in the shadows. He felt a deep sense of fear, not of failure, but of the realization that he might not be strong enough to keep going. For a long, agonizing minute, he reached for the phone to turn off the alarm and surrender. But as his finger hovered over the screen, he caught his reflection in the darkened window. He saw the slumped shoulders of a man who was about to give up. He saw the same man who had sat in the park with a cardboard box. And in that moment, he realized that if he lay back down now, he wasn't just losing an hour of sleep. He was losing his life. His breathing was heavy, a jagged rhythm in the silence. He didn't feel inspired. He didn't feel motivated. He felt miserable, but he forced his muscles to move. He stood up, his legs shaking under the pressure of his own resolve. He didn't need passion today. He needed relentless consistency. He walked to the kitchen and gripped the counter until his knuckles turned white. He knew that this was the most important 5:00 a.m. of his life. If he could beat the wall today, he could beat anything. But as he stared out at the cold, rainy street, a new doubt appeared. The effort was immense. But where were the results? Was he just a man running in circles in the dark? Chapter 8. First light of hope. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the city air crisp and remarkably fresh. Elias sat at his desk, the clock showing 7:30 a.m. For the first time in months, he wasn't looking at his screen with dread. He was looking at an email, a response from a potential client he had reached out to during his deep work sessions last week. They were interested in his proposal. It wasn't a $1 million contract, but it was a yes. In a world that had been saying no to him for so long, that one word felt like a symphony. These were the small wins, the tiny sparks that prove the fire is finally catching. Elias felt a surge of energy that didn't come from caffeine. It came from achievement. He realized that the 5 a.m. blueprint was actually working because he had spent those quiet, uninterrupted hours sharpening his skills. He was now prepared when the opportunity arrived. He looked at his reflection in the window again. The man he saw today was different from the one who hit the wall just days ago. His shoulders were straighter, and his eyes had a clarity that only comes from knowing you have done the work. He decided to go for his morning run. But this time, his legs didn't feel like lead. They felt like engines. As he reached the top of a hill overlooking the city, the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. For a moment, Elias stopped and just breathed. He watched the city wake up, the cars starting to move, the lights in buildings flickering on. He felt a profound sense of progress. While everyone else was just starting their day, he had already won his biggest battle. He walked into a local coffee shop on his way back. Usually, he would hide in the corner, feeling invisible and ashamed. But today, he ordered his drink with a firm voice and a polite smile. The barista noticed. "You're an early bird, aren't you? I see you running every morning," she said. That simple recognition hit Elias harder than any trophy. He wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was a man with a routine. He was a man with an identity. He returned to his apartment and looked at his blueprint on the wall. He checked off his tasks for the morning with a thick, bold stroke of his pen. Each checkmark felt like a small victory in a much larger war. He realized that success isn't a destination. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing you are no longer the person you used to be. He had found a rhythm, a steady beat of discipline that was starting to transform his reality. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it was no longer in control. He felt a newfound conviction, a fragile but growing belief that he was actually going to make it. However, as he sat down to continue his work, a shadow crossed his mind. The small wins were beautiful, but the world has a way of testing a man's resolve. He had climbed the first hill, but the mountain was still ahead. Was he ready for the storm that was gathering on the horizon? Chapter 9. The Ultimate Test. Just as the first rays of success began to warm his life, the sky turned black. Elias stood in his kitchen, the 5:00 a.m. alarm ringing in the background. But he didn't move. In his hand was a letter he had received the night before. The potential client, the one who had given him hope, had pulled out of the deal. At the same time, his landlord had given him a final notice: pay the full debt by tomorrow, or the door would be locked. The blueprint on the wall looked like a cruel joke. He had given everything. He had sacrificed sleep, comfort, and his social life. He had been relentless for weeks. And yet, the world had still found a way to crush him. This was the dark night of the soul. It wasn't just a bad day. It was the total collapse of his new reality. He walked to his desk and sat down. But he didn't open his laptop. What was the point? He had followed the rules. He had built the routine. And he was still losing. The voice of his old self, the voice of failure, was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. "I told you so." The voice laughed. "You thought you could change. You thought getting up early would make you a winner. You are still the same broken man, just more tired." Elias felt a wave of absolute despair. He looked at his bed. It looked like a grave, inviting him to lie down and stay there forever. He realized that the hardest part of the journey isn't starting, it's continuing when you feel like you are fighting for nothing. He was alone, in the dark, with no money and no hope. The silence of the 5:00 a.m. hour, which used to feel like power, now felt like a prison. He put his head on the desk and closed his eyes. He felt the weight of every mistake he had ever made. He thought about the people who had doubted him, and he realized they were right. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had tried to play a role that was too big for him. The temptation to quit was no longer a pull. It was a total surrender. He reached out his hand to turn off the alarm, ready to go back to sleep and never wake up to his dreams again. He was standing on the edge of the abyss. One more minute, and the new Elias would be dead. Everything depended on what happened in the next 60 seconds of silence. Could a man who has lost his reason to fight find a way to stand up one more time, or was the dark night finally going to swallow him whole? Chapter 10. The Phoenix Rises. Elias sat in the suffocating silence, his finger millimeters away from the off button on his alarm. The darkness felt like it was physical, pressing against his chest, trying to crush the last spark of his will. But in that moment of total hopelessness, something strange happened. He didn't see a vision of success or a bag of money. Instead, he saw the face of the man he was just a month ago, the man who hid under the covers, the man who lived in fear. A sudden, cold realization washed over him. If he quit now, he would be proving his old self right. He realized that the 5 a.m. blueprint was never about the money or the clients. It was a test of his soul. The universe wasn't trying to stop him. It was asking him, "Who are you when everything goes wrong?" Elias pulled his hand back from the phone. He didn't turn it off. He let it ring. The sound, which had felt like a piercing cry of failure moments ago, now sounded like a battle cry. He stood up, not with the energy of excitement, but with the heavy, unshakable power of a man who has nothing left to lose but his honor. He walked to the bathroom and looked into the mirror. He didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a warrior whose eyes were finally clear. "I am not my bank account," he whispered to the glass. "I am not my job title. I am the man who gets up." He didn't just splash water on his face this time. He submerged his head in the basin, letting the icy temperature shock his entire system. He returned to his desk, not to wait for a miracle, but to create one. He realized that as long as he could breathe, as long as he could choose to stand up at 5:00 a.m., he was still the master of his fate. This was the resurrection. He didn't need the world to say yes for him to feel powerful. He gave himself the yes. He opened his laptop and began to write a new proposal, not with the desperation of a man trying to survive, but with the authority of a man who knows he is the best at what he does. He worked with a speed and a focus that he had never possessed before. The fatigue was gone, replaced by a burst of spiritual energy. He was no longer afraid of the dark night. He realized that the sun doesn't just happen. He was the phoenix, and the fire that was supposed to burn him was now the very thing that was making him rise. He worked through the dawn, and as the first light of the sun hit his blueprint on the wall, he knew. The wall was broken. The old Elias was dead. But would this internal victory be enough to save him from the external world that was still knocking at his door? The final battle was about to begin. Chapter 11. The morning that changed everything. The deadline had arrived. It was 5:00 a.m. on the day Elias was supposed to be evicted. The day his world was supposed to end. But Elias didn't look like a man facing defeat. He sat in his organized apartment, dressed in his best suit, staring at the screen of his laptop with a calm power. He had spent the last 72 hours in a state of flow that most people never experience. He hadn't just written a proposal. He had created a masterpiece of strategy. This was the moment of the grand victory. At 9 a.m., he walked into the boardroom of a company even larger than the one that had rejected him. He didn't walk in with a cardboard box. He walked in with a blueprint. When he began to speak, the room went silent. He didn't just present data. He spoke with the authority of a man who had conquered himself in the dark. He explained his vision with a clarity and a passion that left the directors speechless. He wasn't begging for a job. He was offering them a future. The CEO looked at Elias. Then, at the clock, "You sent this proposal at 5:15 a.m. yesterday." The CEO remarked, "Most of my team wasn't even awake then." Elias simply nodded. The world is won by those who are awake, while others are dreaming. He replied. The CEO smiled, reached across the table, and shook his hand. The deal was done. The contract was more than enough to pay his debts 10 times over. But as Elias walked out of that building and into the bright morning sun, he realized something profound. The check in his pocket was great, but it wasn't the victory. The real victory was the fact that he was no longer afraid of the 5:00 a.m. alarm. He had faced the abyss and didn't blink. He had turned his breaking point into a launching pad. He felt a sense of splendor, a sacred joy that comes from knowing you are exactly who you were meant to be. He looked up at the sky. The same sky that had looked so cold and indifferent weeks ago. Now, it looked like a canvas of endless possibilities. He had reached the summit of his first mountain. He was free. He had regained his home, his career, and most importantly, his self-respect. The man who couldn't beat his alarm clock had just beaten the odds of an entire city. But what happens when the fight is over? Does the fire go out? Or does it become a permanent light? Elias was no longer just a man with a routine. He was a man with a mission. But how would he use this new power to change the lives of others? Chapter 12. The Master of Dawn. Success had changed Elias's bank account. But the 5 a.m. blueprint had changed his soul. He stood on the balcony of his new apartment, looking out at the city at 5:15 a.m. The air was still cold. The streets were still dark. But the internal struggle was gone. He no longer needed to fight the urge to stay in bed. He didn't need to bargain with his willpower. Waking up with the sun was no longer something he did. It was who he was. This was the birth of a new identity. Elias moved through his morning routine with the quiet grace of a master. He realized that the greatest benefit of discipline isn't what you get, but who you become. He looked at the challenges of his new, high-level job not with anxiety, but with a calm, predatory confidence. When a problem arose, he didn't see a threat. He saw a lesson. He had learned that a man who can conquer the first hour of the day can conquer any hour that follows. His physical appearance had transformed. But it was the look in his eyes that truly signaled his rebirth. There was a depth there. A steady light of a man who had been to the bottom of the abyss and climbed back out stone by stone. He walked through the world with a sense of yuiquan, not because he was better than others, but because he was finally better than his former self. He no longer sought validation from the world. The only approval he needed was the one he earned every morning at 5:00 a.m. He had reached a state of serenity. The chaos of the city, the noise of the media, and the opinions of his critics no longer had the power to disturb his inner peace. He was the architect of his own environment. He chose his friends, his habits, and his thoughts with surgical precision. He had built a fortress of discipline around his life, and nothing could breach it without his permission. He looked at his old journals, the ones filled with broken promises, and felt a sense of gratitude. They were the map that led him here. He realized that his failure had been his greatest teacher. Without the pain of losing everything, he would never have found the strength to rebuild anything. He was no longer running away from his past. He was standing on top of it. As he watched the first golden sliver of light touch the horizon, he felt a deep, resonant sense of purpose. He had found the blueprint for his own life. But he knew his journey wasn't over. Now that he had mastered the dawn for himself, how could he use this light to guide those who were still lost in the dark? Chapter 13. The Eternal Lesson. Elias sat on a park bench. The same bench where he had once sat defeated with a cardboard box of failure. But today, the box was gone, replaced by a simple notebook filled with the names of young entrepreneurs he was now mentoring. He watched a young man nearby, looking frustrated and tired, staring at his phone with the same ghost-like expression Elias once wore. Elias didn't look at him with pity. He looked at him with compassion. He knew that within that struggle lay the seed of a giant. This was the phase of legacy where success stops being about me and starts being about us. He realized that the 5 a.m. blueprint was never really about the clock. The clock was just a tool to measure his courage. He had learned that the most valuable thing he owned wasn't his new company. It was his mindset. He now understood that wisdom is not something you read in a book. It is something you earn through discipline and relentless action. He looked back at his months of struggle, the cold floors, the silent tears, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life doesn't happen to you, he whispered, writing a final note in his journal. Life happens for you. Every failure was a lesson in disguise. Every rejection was a redirection. He had discovered that the secret to a great life is found in the things you do when no one is watching. He realized that wisdom is the ability to see the opportunity in every obstacle. He no longer feared the storms of life because he had built a foundation that could not be shaken. Elias stood up and began to walk, his pace steady and full of command. He wasn't just walking to his office. He was walking into his future. He knew that his journey would continue to have challenges. But he also knew he had the blueprint to overcome them. He had become a lighthouse for others. A living proof that no matter how far you fall, you can always rise again. He looked at the city skyline, a landscape he had once feared, and saw it as a playground for his new life. He had found his voice, his strength, and his soul in the silence of 5:00 a.m. The story of Elias was no longer about a man who lost his job. It was a story about the power of the human spirit to recreate itself from the ashes of despair. But the most important question remained. The blueprint was ready. The story was told. But who would be the next person to pick up the pen and write their own victory? Chapter 14. Your turn to rise. The journey of Elias is more than just a story. It is a mirror reflecting your own potential. We have seen him face the cold reality of failure, the pain of being ignored by the world, and the crushing weight of his own excuses. But we also saw him choose a different path. He chose to build a blueprint in the dark so that he could own the light of the sun. Through discipline, focus, and courage, he transformed from a ghost into a master of his own destiny. Now, the question is no longer about Elias. It is about you. As we close this chapter at Level Up Graded Readers, I want you to look at your own life. Are you hitting the snooze button on your dreams? Are you waiting for a tomorrow that never comes? Remember the lessons we have learned today. Your life is a reflection of your morning routine. True success is not a gift. It is a result of the quiet, repetitive, and often difficult choices you make when no one is watching. You have the vocabulary of a winner now. You understand the power of relentless action and the importance of a strong mindset. Do not let this energy fade away as soon as the audio stops. Take the first step today. It doesn't have to be a giant leap. It just needs to be a movement toward the person you want to become. If you are ready to stop being a spectator and start being the architect of your life, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Level Up Graded Readers and commit to your growth. Every story we tell is designed to sharpen your English and strengthen your spirit. I want to see your commitment right now in the comments below. Write your own vow. Write, I am the architect of my life, and I will rise. Let the world know that you are no longer drifting. Let us know that you are ready to build your own 5 a.m. blueprint. The sun is about to rise. The world is waiting for you to claim your place in it. Will you stay in the warmth of the covers? Or will you step into the cold air of greatness? The choice is yours. We will be here to guide you every step of the way. This is Level Up Graded Readers. And your new life starts now.